Let's get the reaction now of Democratic Congressman for Texas, Joaquin Castro. He's the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us. By phone, you heard the president today. Were you satisfied with what he said?
Well, I think all Americans were glad that the president acknowledged these horrific tragedies and spoke about moving together in a bipartisan way to combat gun violence. But in the president's remarks, he blamed the media, he blamed the internet, he blamed video games, he blamed everybody but himself. And this president has used language that has inspired hate and incited violence. And if you look at the language that the terrorist or the shooter used in his manifesto, it's eerily similar to language that President Trump uses routinely in press conferences, in campaign speeches, and in paid Facebook ads that he and his campaign are running and have been running in the last few weeks and months getting ready for his reelection. So the Congressional Hispanic Caucus is going to be asking him to commit to stop using the language of invasion when speaking about immigrants, and specifically Hispanic immigrants to this country.
A couple of days before the attacks, a former FBI counterterrorism official wrote in the New York Times that he was afraid that something like this was going to happen. In your conversations with members of the Hispanic community, had they been nervous that the rhetoric of the moment was going to lead to some kind of attack against them?
Yes, the president has reopened old wounds. There have been times throughout American history where, just as other ethnic groups have been targeted, the Hispanic community has been targeted. And starting 4 years ago, when President Trump began his campaign for the presidency, he described Mexican immigrants as criminals and rapists. And the anger and the resentment and the hate that's directed towards those Hispanic immigrants spills over to Hispanic citizens, Hispanic Americans. And that's what happened in El Paso a few days ago. And there's no way to contain that kind of resentment and hatred to people who are undocumented immigrants. That is horrible on its own, but we should not be under the illusion that that kind of hatred can be contained to people with a certain legal status. It spills over and affects everybody who looks like that.
Congressman, your fellow Democrat in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, was interviewed many times this weekend. He called the president a white supremacist, an open, avowed racist. Do you think he's a white supremacist?
Yeah, I think he's a racist and a white nationalist. And I think he has encouraged that ideology through his language. And also, it's not just the president, by the way. For years in Texas, the state leadership, specifically Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, through his words in 2014, he called Hispanic immigration an invasion and talked about immigrants bringing third world diseases to Texas. Governor Greg Abbott has, in a more low-key way, stoked the same fears for political gain. He signed into law and championed legislation known as SB4 a few years ago that allows for racial profiling by police officers, by law enforcement of Hispanics. So this has been brewing for a long time. Donald Trump, in many ways, was simply more outward and direct about that kind of racial resentment.
Okay. Congressman Joaquin Castro from Texas, thank you. And our condolences, of course, to the people of Texas. Thank you very much for joining the program. For more on the president's response to the weekend's attacks, we're joined now by Mica Mosbacher. She's a member of the Trump 2020 Advisory Board and, of course, a Texas native. Mica, thank you very much for joining us. Has Texas become the front line in this dark underbelly of American cultural divide, where racism and white supremacy can be stoked because there are fears that Texas is going to flip from Republican to Democrat, and so it's kind of all-out civil war for the votes you can get down there?
No, I don't think so. This is an issue that's been brewing in this country for decades, going back to Columbine, for example, with mass shootings. It's really important to emphasize that this morning the president gave a passionate, compelling statement, and he condemned white supremacy and hate groups in this country, in addition to racism and bigotry, stating that they have no place in the United States. And that was one of the strongest statements I've heard this president make. Secondly, this is not a time where we need to be blaming one another. This is an opportunity, as the president stated, it's an opportunity for the Democratic caucus to work with Republicans to begin to make small steps toward curbing this type of violence that is existing in this country. And I think it is extremely unfair to blame President Trump. Ben Carson, who's a man of color, who's the housing secretary, has stated that he's worked with President Trump for years. He's not a racist. After all, when there were the congressional baseball shootings in 2017, that shooter had worked for Bernie Sanders and had the names of Republicans in his pocket, and yet the media did not blame Bernie Sanders.
But Mica,
what we need to focus on in this country
at a rally in Florida, the president said, what are we going to do about this invasion of immigrants? And somebody in the crowd shouted out, shoot them. And the president's response was to chuckle. He made a joke about it, saying only in the panhandle of Florida can you get away with that kind of comment. That's not helpful, is it? At the very least, that's not helpful.
Well, he also came out and denounced the chant, "Send them back," that was from supporters at a previous rally. What I think we're missing is this larger discussion needs to be had about the fact that we need to enforce the laws of this land and to strengthen our borders. And I am from Texas. We have a very large Hispanic population, and they feel that they came to this country legally. These individuals waited in line, and they don't want an immigrant cutting in line, such as if you're in a supermarket, someone cuts in line in front of you, you're angry about it. But what we need, and what the president is trying to focus on, is the fact that we need to, one, look at red flag laws. Those are laws that allow a family member or a police member to go to a state court and take away firearms from an individual that is deemed to be harmful to himself or to others. For example, in Parkland, following that shooting, that individual had interacted with the mental health societies in Broward County. That is a part, and had been reported to law enforcement. That fell through the cracks. At Sutherland Springs Church in Texas, that shooter had gone through a U.S. Air Force court-martial. And the other thing is that that man was able to purchase a firearm even though he had a domestic violence conviction. So we have some work to do in this country. The president has already strengthened the national background checks, NICS law, and also there's a school violence law, Stop School Violence, that passed Congress in the House, and it's sitting now in the Senate. We can do something to correct these issues if we focus on a broader, helpful conversation rather than blaming one another.
Okay, Mica, thank you very much for joining us.